While the world burned, they built banks. For centuries, one nation mastered the art of not picking a side, becoming the secret treasurer for all of them. This is not a story about peace. This is the anatomy of calculated survival transformed into a multi-trillion-dollar industry, holding an estimated quarter of all the world's offshore wealth, enough to buy every publicly traded company in Germany twice over. We will dissect how Switzerland weaponized neutrality, turning geopolitical chaos into permanent wealth. A strategy you must understand before the next global conflict erupts. The strategy began not with morality, but with geography and trauma. Switzerland sits at the crossroads of Europe, surrounded by empires that spent centuries using its valleys as battlegrounds. By the early 1800s, the Swiss Confederation had been invaded by Napoleon, occupied and drained of resources. The lesson was carved into their mountains. To be weak was to be a pawn, but to be a threat was to be a target. The Swiss discovered a third option: become indispensable to all sides by threatening none. In 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, the great powers of Europe gathered to redraw the map after Napoleon's defeat. Switzerland sent diplomats with a single objective: obtain permanent neutrality guaranteed by treaty. This was not a request born from pacifism. It was a demand rooted in cold strategic calculation. The Swiss argued that a neutral buffer zone in the heart of Europe would prevent future conflicts from igniting on their soil. More importantly, they promised to remain militarily defensible, ensuring no foreign army could use Swiss territory as a corridor for invasion. The great powers, Austria, Britain, France, Prussia, and Russia, saw the value. A neutral Switzerland meant one less variable in the European balance of power, one less territory to fight over, one less front to defend. The treaty was signed. Swiss neutrality became international law. But the real genius was not in the treaty itself. It was in what Switzerland did next. They fortified their mountains into an impregnable fortress, building an army designed not to conquer, but to make invasion unbearably costly. Every bridge could be demolished, every tunnel could be sealed, every valley could become a killing ground. The message was clear: neutrality is not weakness. It is the absence of threat combined with the certainty of pain for anyone who violates it. Then came the economic pivot. Switzerland understood that neutrality without economic utility was a privilege that could be revoked. So they built an economy designed to serve all sides. Banking became the cornerstone. Swiss banks offered something no other nation could: absolute discretion, political stability, and legal protections for depositors regardless of nationality. In a world where empires rose and fell, where revolutions devoured fortunes, and where wars destroyed currencies, Switzerland became the vault. The place where wealth could sleep undisturbed while the world outside convulsed. By the mid-1800s, Swiss banks were financing railroads in Austria, industries in Germany, and trade routes across Europe. They held deposits from monarchs, merchants, and revolutionaries alike. The Swiss did not care who won or lost. They cared only that everyone needed a place to store value beyond the reach of their enemies. Neutrality was not a philosophy. It was a business model. And the product was trust in a world defined by betrayal. But a legal treaty is just paper. In 1914, when the Great War set Europe ablaze, that paper was about to be tested by fire and steel. Surrounded by warring empires, Germany and Austria to the north and east, France and Italy to the west and south, the Swiss could have been crushed by any side that chose to violate their neutrality. But they were not. Why? Because every belligerent needed Switzerland more than they needed Swiss territory. The Swiss played the most dangerous game in financial history, banking for both sides simultaneously. German industrialists deposited gold in Zurich to shield assets from Allied seizure. French aristocrats moved fortunes to Geneva to escape domestic instability. British intelligence used Swiss intermediaries to fund espionage networks in enemy territory. Switzerland became the chessboard where all players moved pieces, but the board itself remained untouched. The Swiss franc, backed by gold and fortified by neutrality, became the only stable currency in a continent drowning in war debt and inflation. But this was not passive neutrality. It was active economic warfare disguised as impartiality. Swiss banks financed German war industries through loans structured to appear as private transactions. At the same time, they processed Allied payments and held reserves for French and British governments. The Swiss were not blind to the moral implications. They simply understood that survival required indifference to outcomes. The moment Switzerland chose a side, it would become a combatant. And combatants get destroyed. Compare this to the fate of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, which collapsed in the 1350s after flooding China with fiat paper money to finance endless wars. The Yuan emperors believed they could print wealth into existence. They were wrong. Hyperinflation destroyed trust in the currency. Merchants refused to accept it, and the economy disintegrated. The dynasty fell not to foreign invasion, but to internal collapse caused by monetary recklessness. Switzerland learned the opposite lesson. Money must be anchored to something immovable. Gold, stability, neutrality. By the time World War I ended, Switzerland had emerged richer than before the war began. German marks and Austrian crowns were worthless. The French franc was crippled. The British pound was strained. But the Swiss franc was untouched. Fortunes that survived the war were the ones held in Swiss vaults. The lesson was broadcast to the world. When empires collapse, Switzerland remains. The wealthy took note. The interwar period saw an explosion of deposits into Swiss banks, not because Switzerland was morally superior, but because it was structurally immune to the chaos consuming its neighbors. The British banking crisis of 1797 had taught the world that even the most powerful financial centers could collapse under the weight of war debt and speculation. Britain, the global hegemon of its era, faced bank runs, currency devaluation, and a suspension of gold payments. Switzerland studied this carefully. They built a system designed to never face such vulnerability. Small, decentralized, armed, neutral, and absolutely committed to honoring deposits regardless of who deposited them or why. The pattern repeated in the 1970s, when the post-war order collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The United States had anchored global finance to the dollar under the Bretton Woods system, promising that every dollar could be redeemed for gold. But by 1971, the cost of the Vietnam War and domestic spending had drained U.S. gold reserves. President Nixon severed the dollar's link to gold, ending the Bretton Woods system and unleashing global monetary chaos. Currencies floated. Inflation surged. Oil-producing nations, no longer willing to accept depreciating dollars, quadrupled oil prices. The world entered an era of stagflation, where growth stagnated and prices exploded. Switzerland, once again, stood apart. The Swiss franc remained partially backed by gold, and Swiss monetary policy remained disciplined. While the dollar lost purchasing power and European currencies wobbled, the Swiss franc became the ultimate safe haven. Oil-rich nations from the Middle East poured petrodollars into Swiss banks. Wealthy individuals from collapsing economies in Latin America and Africa moved assets to Zurich and Geneva. The Swiss banking system swelled with capital fleeing instability. The franc appreciated. Swiss wealth multiplied. This echoes the fate of the Achaemenid Persian Empire in 330 BC, which fell not merely to Alexander the Great's armies, but to decades of unsustainable military spending that drained the imperial treasury. Persia had built the largest empire in the ancient world, but maintaining it required endless wars and enormous expenses. When the empire finally faced a disciplined adversary in Alexander, it disintegrated because it had spent itself into fragility. The Swiss understood this historical law. Overextension destroys empires. Restraint preserves nations. But the 1970s also revealed something deeper about the Swiss model. As fiat currencies became the global norm and central banks abandoned gold entirely, Switzerland maintained a hybrid system. The Swiss National Bank held significant gold reserves, and Swiss law required the franc to be backed by a percentage of gold and foreign assets. This was not nostalgia. It was insurance. The Swiss had studied every major currency collapse in history and concluded that trust in money requires an anchor beyond political promises. When the US abandoned gold, Switzerland did not. And that restraint became a magnet for global capital. This mechanism is timeless. When the European Union faces debt crises, investors flee to Swiss francs. When the US dollar wobbles under the weight of multi-trillion-dollar deficits, the franc appreciates. When geopolitical tensions rise, wealth flows to Switzerland. The mechanism is the same as it was in 1815. Neutrality creates trust, and trust becomes the foundation of wealth preservation. The Swiss weaponized geography, law, and monetary discipline into a permanent advantage. They built a nation that profits from the chaos of others without participating in it. And yet, the Swiss model contains a warning. Neutrality requires constant vigilance. The moment Switzerland becomes perceived as taking a side, the entire system collapses. The moment Swiss banks lose their reputation for discretion and stability, capital flees. The Swiss understand this. That is why they adapted when the world changed. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new challenge for Switzerland. For decades, Swiss banks had thrived on espionage accounts, hidden fortunes from both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the constant flow of capital seeking refuge from ideological conflict. When the Soviet Union collapsed, so did a significant portion of that business model. The enemy vanished. The need for absolute secrecy diminished. Western governments, no longer distracted by existential threats, turned their attention to tax evasion and money laundering. Switzerland faced pressure to open its books. The Swiss adapted. They negotiated treaties that relaxed banking secrecy in cases of proven criminality, while maintaining protections for legitimate wealth. They diversified their economy beyond banking, investing in pharmaceuticals, precision manufacturing, and technology. They maintained their military readiness, ensuring that neutrality remained credible. And they reinforced their legal frameworks to remain attractive to global capital, even as transparency increased. The lesson: adaptation is not betrayal. It is survival. Who survived the great collapses of history? Those who understood that wealth preservation requires neutrality from political and economic conflicts. During the Mongol Yuan dynasty's hyperinflationary collapse, the survivors were merchants who refused to hold paper currency and instead held silver, jade, and foreign coins. During the British banking crisis of 1797, the survivors were those who had diversified holdings across multiple nations and kept reserves in gold. During the Achaemenid collapse, the survivors were Greek mercenaries and regional governors who had hoarded gold and could operate independently of the dying empire. The principle is timeless: position assets to be immune from the conflicts of others. This means geographic diversification, holding wealth in multiple jurisdictions, not just your home country. This means asset diversification, balancing equities, real estate, commodities, and forms of value that cannot be devalued by decree. This means legal diversification, understanding the laws of multiple nations and structuring holdings to benefit from the most protective frameworks. But the deepest lesson from Swiss history is the concept of personal neutrality. Do not tie your financial survival to the success of any single government, currency, or political ideology. Governments collapse, currencies fail, ideologies become liabilities. The Swiss succeeded because they refused to become dependent on any one power. Individuals can apply the same logic. When the next global conflict erupts, whether it is military, economic, or technological, those who survive will be those who positioned themselves to benefit from stability rather than chaos, who held assets beyond the reach of any single state, and who understood that true wealth begins with autonomy. History shows that preservation begins with custody. When citizens reclaim control over their own value, they become immune to the confiscations, devaluations, and expropriations that have destroyed fortunes throughout history. The Swiss understood this at the national level. You must understand it at the personal level. Switzerland didn't become the world's bank vault by accident. It became the vault by mastering one law of financial history: chaos is permanent. While empires bankrupted themselves on war, from the paper money of the Yuan dynasty to the overextended credit of Great Britain to the military spending that destroyed Persia, the Swiss weaponized restraint. They fortified their geography, disciplined their currency, and built legal frameworks that made trust more valuable than territory. Today, as global debt hits unprecedented levels and central banks print currency without limit, the lesson is urgent. The next great conflict, economic, military, or technological, is not a question of if, but when. Those who position themselves with personal neutrality, geographic diversification, and assets beyond the reach of any single government will be the ones who survive. Those who remain dependent on the promises of collapsing systems will be the ones who lose everything. The Swiss model teaches one principle above all: when money loses trust, people rebuild it. Sometimes in gold, sometimes in law, sometimes in code. The form changes, the principle does not. Trust must be anchored to something immovable, and those who control that anchor control the future. The records from centuries of financial warfare are clear. Neutrality is not passivity. It is strategy. And in a world where empires rise and fall, the greatest power is the power to remain standing when everyone else has fallen. If this analysis opened your perspective, subscribe to the Financial Archive to decode other patterns.